The alarm goes off. It's 6:30 a.m., Monday. You hit snooze once, maybe twice. Then you're up. Shower, coffee, getting dressed. You're out the door by 7:45 for a commute that takes 35 minutes if traffic's good, 50 if it's not. You get to the office by 8:30. You work until 5:30, sometimes 6 if there's a project. Commute home, another 40 minutes. You're back at 6:40. You make dinner, eat, maybe watch something. It's 9 p.m. You've got 2, maybe 3 hours before you need to sleep to do it all again tomorrow. And somewhere in there, you're supposed to build wealth. You're supposed to save money. You're supposed to get ahead. Except you look at your bank account and you're not getting ahead. You're making $63,000 a year. That's decent money. That should be enough. But it never quite feels like enough. You're always tight, always calculating, always wondering if you can afford things. And there's this quiet realization you keep having, but don't fully examine. The 9 to 5 isn't working, not the way it's supposed to. You're doing everything right, showing up, working hard, being responsible, but the math isn't adding up. My name's Peter, and if you've ever felt like your job is supposed to provide financial security but somehow doesn't, and you want to understand why the traditional employment model is mathematically failing most people, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what we were told about stable jobs and steady income building wealth is based on an economic reality that no longer exists. So let's start with what a $63,000 job actually gives you after you account for everything it costs. You're making $63,000 a year. That's $5,250 a month before taxes. Sounds comfortable. That should provide a decent middle-class life. After taxes, federal, state, FICA, you're taking home about $3,900 a month. That's your real number. $3,900 to cover everything. Rent, $1,550. You're in a one-bedroom in a decent area, nothing fancy. That's $18,600 a year just for housing, down to $2,350. Car payment, $395. You need a car to get to work. The commute isn't accessible by public transit. Insurance, $170. Gas, $160. That's $725 on transportation, down to $1,625. Student loans, $315. Health insurance through work, but there's still the premium, $145. Groceries, $360. Utilities and phone, $185. That's another $1,005, down to $620. So after the mandatory expenses, the things you absolutely have to pay to exist and get to work, you've got $620 left for the entire month. That's clothes, any social life, any unexpected expense, any savings. $620. And here's what nobody talks about. That job requires more from you than just the 40 hours. You're commuting 1 hour and 15 minutes per day. That's 6.25 hours per week. Plus the time getting ready for work, 30 minutes per day, 2.5 hours per week. Plus the unpaid lunch hour, 5 hours per week. So your 40-hour work week is actually consuming about 54 hours of your week when you include all the time the job requires. And for that 54 hours, you're netting $3,900 a month after taxes and before any other expenses. That's the actual trade. 54 hours of your week for $3,900 in actual take-home pay, which after mandatory expenses leaves you with $620.
Most people think the solution to feeling financially squeezed is to work harder, get promoted, earn more at their job. But before we get to promotions, we need to understand why the math of employment has fundamentally changed. Because this isn't just about your personal situation. This is about a structural shift that happened decades ago and has been quietly destroying middle-class wealth ever since. To understand why your job feels like a trap today, we have to rewind the clock. We have to look at the exact moment in history when the math of the American dream was quietly rewritten without your permission. If you talk to your grandparents, they will tell you about a time when a single average income could support a family of 4, buy a house, 2 cars, and pay for an annual vacation, all while putting money into savings. And they aren't lying. That world actually existed. Between the end of World War II and the early 1970s, the economy operated on a very simple, very fair equation. If you worked harder, you got richer. During that period, worker productivity, meaning how much value a worker created for their company, rose in perfect lockstep with worker compensation. If a worker produced 20% more value, their paycheck went up 20%. It was a balanced scale. And then came 1971. In the early 1970s, a massive structural shift happened in the global economy. The US moved off the gold standard, technology began entering the workplace, and corporate prioritization shifted entirely toward maximizing shareholder value above all else. And a gap opened up, a massive, terrifying gap that explains almost all of your financial anxiety today. From 1979 to 2022, net productivity in the United States grew by an astonishing 64.6%. Because of computers, software, automation, and emails, you are doing the work of 3 people from the 1980s. You are generating massive, unprecedented amounts of wealth for your employer. But during that exact same period, from 1979 to 2022, while your productivity went up almost 65%, the hourly pay of typical workers grew by only 14.8%. Let that sink in. You became 65% better, faster, and more efficient at making your company money, and in return, your real wages barely moved. So where did that extra 50% of the value you created go? It didn't vanish into thin air. It went straight to the top. It went into corporate profits, stock buybacks, and executive compensation. In 1965, the average CEO made 21 times as much as their typical worker. Today, the average CEO makes over 340 times what their typical worker makes. You are not getting paid for the value you create. You are getting paid the minimum amount required to keep you from quitting. That is the mathematical definition of a salary. A salary is not a reward for your hard work. It is a subscription fee a corporation pays to indefinitely lease your time and extract your surplus value. And this wage productivity gap has only accelerated. Worker productivity has increased by about 60% since 2000. Wages have increased by about 17%. The gap, that extra value being created, is going somewhere, but it's not going to the workers creating it. So you're working at a job where you're creating more value per hour than workers did 20 years ago, but you're capturing less of that value as income. The job is more productive, you're more productive, but you're not proportionally wealthier.
Now let's look at what happens when you try to fix this the traditional way. What happens when you get a raise at a traditional job? You've been at the company 3 years. You're good at what you do. You get promoted. Your salary goes from $63,000 to $72,000. That's a $9,000 raise. Significant. After taxes, that's about $6,300 more per year. That's $525 a month in extra take-home pay. And here's what happens to that $525. Your commute is now 50 minutes instead of 35 because you moved to a slightly nicer apartment closer to work. $1,750 instead of $1,550. That's $200 gone. You upgraded your car because the old one was starting to have issues, and with the promotion, you felt like you could afford something more reliable. Payment went from $395 to $485. That's $90 gone. You're eating out more for lunch because you're busier with the new role, and packing lunch feels impossible. That's another $120 gone. Your monthly discretionary went from $620 to $735. You're still tight. You're still calculating. You're still stressed about money. You're just doing it at a higher income level while working more hours in a more demanding role. And here's what makes the promotion math even worse. As a W-2 employee, you are the single most heavily taxed entity in the modern economy. A business owner makes money, spends what they need to survive, and gets taxed on what is left over. You, the employee, get taxed before the money even touches your hands. So that $9,000 raise, after federal taxes, state taxes, Social Security, and Medicare, it's actually only about $6,300 in real spendable cash. That's $525 a month. But what did that $525 actually cost you? As a manager, you're now expected to be available on Slack at 8 p.m. You're expected to check emails on Sunday mornings. Your 40-hour week has quietly morphed into a 55-hour week. You increased your actual hours worked by almost 40%. You exponentially increased your stress levels, all for a net pay increase of barely 15%. Mathematically, your hourly rate just went down. You are literally making less money per hour of effort than you were before the promotion. You didn't climb a ladder. You just volunteered to carry a heavier boulder up the exact same hill. You're lying in bed on a Wednesday night. You're exhausted. Not the good kind of tired that comes from a fulfilling day, the heavy kind. The kind where you're thinking about tomorrow's meetings, tomorrow's commute, tomorrow's work, and you're doing mental math again. You're thinking about that $620 in discretionary spending, about how your car insurance is going up next month, about how your friend is having a destination wedding and you can't afford to go, about how you're 31 years old and you've been working for 9 years and you have maybe $11,000 in savings. 9 years, full-time employment, responsible, consistent,
and $11,000 in savings. That's not enough for an emergency fund. That's barely enough to cover 2 months of expenses if you lost your job. And that tightness in your chest, it's not because you're bad with money. It's because the math of traditional employment doesn't work anymore. The job is designed to keep you employed, not to make you financially independent. Those are not the same thing.
So here's how people who actually build wealth while working regular jobs think about this differently. And this is key. They don't think of their job as their wealth-building vehicle. They think of their job as their cash flow engine that funds their actual wealth building. They take that $63,000 salary and they see it for what it is, a relatively stable income source that will never make them wealthy on its own, but can fund investments that might. So they keep their lifestyle below what their salary could afford. They stay in the $1,400 apartment when they could stretch to $1,700. They keep driving the paid-off car when they could afford a payment. They don't upgrade their lifestyle with their raises. And that difference, that gap between what they earn and what they spend, they invest aggressively. Not in the company 401k exclusively, though they do contribute enough to get the match, but in accessible investments, in things they control, in building wealth that isn't locked away until they're 65. When they get that raise from $63,000 to $72,000, they don't see an extra $525 to spend. They see an extra $400 to save and invest. And they do that consistently for years. And here's what actually changes in their life. They're still working the job, still doing the commute, still living a relatively modest lifestyle. But after 5 years, they've got $35,000 invested. After 10 years, $95,000. After 15 years, $180,000. They're not rich, but they're not fragile. They could quit their job tomorrow and survive for 2 years while they figure out something better. They're negotiating from a position of strength. They're saying no to things that don't serve them. They're making career moves based on what's right for them, not what they can't afford to walk away from. Same job, same salary, completely different financial reality, because they recognized that the job itself isn't the wealth-building mechanism. It's the fuel for the actual wealth building, which happens outside of work.
Let's talk about what happens over a career if you follow the traditional path versus if you recognize the limitation early. Traditional path. You work from 23 to 65, 42 years. You start at $45,000, end at $85,000 through standard raises and promotions. Average salary across your career, maybe $65,000. You save in your 401k, maybe 6% to get the match. You contribute about $3,900 per year on average. Over 42 years, with 7% returns, that grows to about $800,000. Not bad, but you're 65. You worked for 42 years. You earned about $2.7 million in gross wages over your career, and you have $800,000 in retirement savings. Alternative path. Same career, same wages, but you keep lifestyle fixed at $50,000 annual spending, regardless of income. You invest the difference aggressively starting at age 25. By 40, you have enough invested that you could work part-time or take lower-paying work that's more fulfilling. By 50, you are financially independent and work is optional. Same total career earnings, completely different life trajectory, because you recognized early that the job wasn't the wealth builder. It was the cash flow that funded actual wealth building. Now, let me be very clear about something. This isn't about demonizing employment. Jobs provide income, structure, social connection, purpose for many people. That's all real and valuable. But the promise that traditional, stable employment leads to wealth and security, that promise is outdated. The math doesn't support it anymore. Productivity gains don't flow to workers. Wages don't keep pace with cost of living increases in housing, healthcare, education. The retirement age keeps pushing further out. The 9-to-5 can be part of a wealth-building strategy, but it can't be the entire strategy. And recognizing that early, recognizing that your job is a tool, not a destination, that changes everything about how you build financial security. So here's the thing about the working class illusion.
It's not that jobs are bad or that working is wrong. It's that we've been sold a narrative about stable employment leading to prosperity that's mathematically obsolete. The 9-to-5 worked great when productivity gains flowed to workers, when housing cost 3 times annual salary instead of 6 times, when healthcare and education were affordable. In that economy, steady employment really did build middle-class wealth. But that economy doesn't exist anymore. And the financial advice we inherited from it, work hard, get promoted, save in your 401k, doesn't produce the same outcomes it used to. The people who build actual wealth while regular jobs understand this. They don't expect their employer to make them wealthy. They use their employer to generate cash flow that they deploy strategically. They see their job clearly for what it is: necessary, valuable, but not sufficient. That clarity, that recognition that the traditional path is mathematically insufficient, is what allows them to build something different, not by abandoning employment, but by refusing to let employment be their only strategy. Your 9-to-5 isn't failing you because you're doing it wrong. It's failing you because the system it was designed for no longer exists. But you can still win. You just have to play the game differently than you were taught. Stop giving the job your soul. Give it exactly what they pay for, and redirect everything else into building your own escape.